Our final study in this course from Joshua to Solomon is on Solomon's reign, and Solomon could be described as Israel's greatest disappointment. He inherited a prosperous, peaceful nation from his father David, and we can raise lots of questions about the legacy he leaves behind. In fact, the story of Solomon is narrated in two different books of the Old Testament, in Second Chronicles and in Kings. Second Chronicles focuses on the temple, and because it focuses on the temple, it tends to have a much more positive approach to Solomon, whereas First Kings takes a wider view of Solomon's reign, and in their way is much more negative and critical.
As Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father had been.
One way of interpreting Solomon is to see him as a good king who was led astray by his wives in the old ways. And as the verse we have just read shows, there is biblical warrant, there's a biblical truth in this, but the fuller biblical picture, in fact, in First Kings is much more nuanced, and in many ways, Solomon becomes a much more interesting character to look at. In essence, Solomon faced the same decision that David faced throughout his reign. Was he going to be a king like the other nations, or was he going to be a king after God's own heart? And if we look at Solomon, we see he is sincere in his request for wisdom, and his devotion in building the temple, and he has genuine interactions with God through dreams, visions, and prayer. Yet, if we look at Deuteronomy chapter 17 and see the things that the king was not supposed to do, what we see is that from very early on in his reign, Solomon is disobeying these commands.
When you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, "Let us set a king over us like all the nations around us," be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold.
If we look at this passage, we can see that these are all things that Solomon does. He accumulates large amounts of silver and gold. He has many horses. He has many wives who lead him astray. And perhaps most significant, one of the key things is that the king was not to take the people back to Egypt. And actually, the first thing that Solomon does as king, once his power has been consolidated, is to marry Pharaoh's daughter. What this means is that by the end of the story, Solomon ends up resembling Pharaoh much more than his own father David. In fact, despite his wisdom and wealth, he ends up oppressing his own people just as any foreign ruler would. We saw in David's reign how having many sons by different wives led to conflict within his household, and this manifests itself in old age over the issue of who would be David's successor. Now, Joab, David's general, sides with Adonijah, who would be the first in line. He naturally. However, Nathan, the prophet, sides with Solomon. It seems that David has promised the throne for Solomon, and Nathan also seems to have the support of another of David's military leaders, Benaiah. And in an attempt to preempt that succession, we read about how Adonijah, with the support of Joab, proclaims himself king. Now, at this point, there are actually two high priests, one called Abiathar, the other called Zadok, and Abiathar sides with Adonijah and presides at his coronation and acclamation as king. Zadok sides with Solomon. And from the way that Nathan approaches Bathsheba and warns her, Bathsheba being Solomon's mother, if we remember, it seems that part of Adonijah's plot involves killing both Bathsheba and Solomon. And the impression that we get of Bathsheba in the first two chapters of Kings is that she was very influential in court circles. And so she approaches David with Nathan and reminds him of the promises made to Solomon, that Solomon would be king. And actually, from his deathbed, David intervenes and makes Solomon king. And Zadok, the other high priest, is the one who is responsible for the coronation. And civil war seems to have been avoided. The rest of the people side with David, and there's no uprising. And Solomon is confirmed at this point as co-king with David, and then when David passes away, he becomes king. Solomon consolidates his power by dealing with his enemies, and he does it through three executions. The first is actually of his own brother Adonijah, who had tried to proclaim himself king, and the excuse for that is that Adonijah had asked to marry David's nurse Abishag, who had looked after him in his period of dying, and that was somehow construed by Solomon as a threat to his reign. He also executes Joab. This is at the request of David as a consequence of the various murders that Joab committed during David's reign. And finally, he executes Benjamin, Shimei, a man who had cursed David when David fled from Jerusalem from Absalom. He was a Benjaminite who seemed to be followed by about 8,000 men, and David had quite wisely let things be when he returned to Jerusalem again. But he asked Solomon to deal with Shimei, and how he does it is first Solomon puts Shimei under house arrest, and then Shimei breaks the house arrest, or basically the house arrest was limiting his scope of travel to Jerusalem. And Shimei breaks this by traveling out of Jerusalem to chase after two slaves who had run away. Now, chasing after slaves who had run away was actually forbidden in the law, and by both breaking God's law and breaking Solomon's restriction, that gave Solomon a cause to execute Shimei. Now, also during David's reign, we saw there were two high priests, Abiathar and Zadok, and we saw how Abiathar had supported Adonijah. But Abiathar had actually always been faithful to David, even during the time of Absalom's rebellion, and Solomon recognizes this, and so he exiles Abiathar, strips him of the priesthood, and that is seen to fulfill the promises or the judgment that God had pronounced on the house of Eli, that no descendant of Eli would remain as a priest. Now, both the deaths of Joab and Shimei can be seen as confirming the law. The execution of Adonijah falls more into a grey area, and it does seem to raise a question: what is Solomon going to behave like the kings of the other nations? And an ominous note is struck in the first verse of chapter 3, which comes after Solomon has dealt with his enemies, when we are told that Solomon made an alliance with Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and married his daughter. Solomon benefited from the fact that David had defeated Israel's surrounding neighbors and granted them peace. And it was actually a time of calm in international affairs. The major surrounding empires were not particularly active during this period. And so Solomon was actually able to reign in a period of peace and prosperity. We don't read about him needing to lead the people of Israel out into battle against foreign invaders. And when God appears to him, Solomon therefore asks God for wisdom to govern the people. He sees he's inherited a blessing, the nation is blessed, and he asks for wisdom. And this is displayed in his judgment in the issue about the two mothers who came to him with claims on baby. And at this point in the story, there's no need to doubt that Solomon is sincere in his devotion to God. Solomon takes advantage of this period of peace and prosperity to embark on a building project, probably something unprecedented in Israelite history and really not repeated on this scale until the times of Herod the Great at the time of Jesus. For the biblical writer, of course, the key building is the temple, and much of First Kings and nearly all of Second Chronicles narration of Solomon's reign is dedicated to the construction of the temple and how it was done and how it was consecrated and how God's glory came and dwelt in the temple. And there seemed to be little reason to doubt Solomon's wholehearted dedication to building the temple and his devotion for God and the sincerity of his prayers. However, this is one of many projects that Solomon builds. Perhaps it's left up to the reader to interpret the The narrator gives us no judgment, but simply mentions that while Solomon took 7 years to build the temple, he took 13 years to build his own palace. And he built palace for many of his wives and many, many other buildings. And this, of course, came at a cost. It required an alliance with Tyre to provide much of the timber for the projects and also much of the specialized work. And in fact, it led Solomon to build up a debt with Hiram, the king of Tyre, which he wasn't able to repay, and he had to surrender 10 towns of Galilee to Tyre as payment. These projects are financed through taxation, through forced labor, and it's not clear how much the burden of this burden fell upon the Israelites. And there is a certain extent that at the very least Solomon is behaving towards the surrounding nations as Egypt had once behaved to the Israelites, and scholars debate among themselves how much of a burden was felt by the people of Israel themselves. Nonetheless, there is a strong sense in the story that whilst the benefits are being felt in Judah and specifically in Jerusalem, much of the price is being paid by the other tribes. And what happens towards especially the second half of Solomon's reign is that this rift between Judah and the rest of Israel, which to an extent probably dates right back to the days of the patriarchs, when Judah actually moves away from his brothers after they sold Joseph into slavery. This rift that seems to always have existed, and it was there in the background in David's reign. By the time of Solomon, it increases until almost by the end of Solomon's reign, it's as if Judah is ruling over the other tribes. Solomon's fall is narrated quite quickly in the book of Kings, and it comes mainly as a consequence of his alliances that he has made with other nations and marriages to foreign women. And it actually seems that Solomon has gone beyond simply allowing them to set up altars to their own gods and worship in Israel, which might have been bad enough, but Solomon himself has started to follow after the gods of the nations, and two are mentioned: Ashereth and also Moloch, probably because it had one of the most repugnant forms of worship with human sacrifice involved. So Solomon's fall is quite serious, and so God rejects him, but out of faithfulness to David decides not to execute the punishment until the end of Solomon's lifetime. But still, at the end of his reign, things are starting to unravel, and Solomon actually faces two rebellions from the Edomites under Hadad and the Syrians under Rezon. What is perhaps significant is that both the Edomites and the Syrians received support from Pharaoh in Egypt, perhaps concerned that Israel was starting to get too powerful. And it's significant because Pharaoh was Solomon's first ally. The first thing that Solomon did was to marry his daughter. And this illustrates a theme which will be common in the Old Testament, and you will see it a lot in the prophets about the foolishness of going back to Egypt and the foolishness of turning to Egypt for help and support. And later on, we read about our prophet Ahijah, who was sent by God to anoint one of Solomon's officials, Jeroboam. And the prophet Ahijah prophesies what will happen after Solomon's death, that God will grant 10 tribes for Jeroboam to rule over. And Solomon's son, however, because of God's promises to David, will nonetheless retain rule over Judah and Jerusalem. Nonetheless, despite his unfaithfulness, Solomon still dies after 40 years of reign, the same number as his father, and the idea of 40 is of a complete period. Solomon leaves behind a complex legacy. On the one hand, the temple is arguably the greatest part of his legacy, and it will shape Israelite religion right up to the time of Jesus. Of course, by the time of Jesus, we are talking about a second temple reconstructed after Solomon's temple had been burnt by the Babylonians and renovated by Herod, who in many ways tried to present himself as a Solomon-like figure. Solomon is also associated with different books of the Bible. There are 2 Psalms which are attributed to him, Psalm 72 and Psalm 127. The book of Proverbs is attributed to Solomon and is probably included proverbs that he himself created. Other proverbs that he collected, we read into like the Proverbs of Argo and Lemuel in the book. It may also include proverbs which other people collected and placed in the book to honor him. He is also associated with Songs of Solomon, which suggests that either he was the author or that the author was honoring him through the book, and scholars still debate this. The relationship between Solomon and Ecclesiastes is an issue of lively debate. The author claims to have registered the teachings, the words of the teacher who is described as a son of David. And this could mean that Solomon is the author or the teacher that is being described. I find it quite convincing that perhaps the first 2 chapters of Solomon of Ecclesiastes are actually a caricature of Solomon and the excesses of his life, but that is just a matter of debate. But this all points to the important legacy that Solomon leaves behind. Nonetheless, despite having been given a wisdom from God, and despite actually we see the sincerity of his initial devotion and the wholehearted way in which he builds the temple, nonetheless, Solomon ends up embodying the characteristics of the evil king of Deuteronomy 17. And he actually confirms Samuel's prophetic warning about kings. And he ends up responsible for the division of the kingdom, and he is soundly responsible for starting a trajectory of idolatry within the nation, which will lead the people ultimately to exile.
He said, "This is what the king who will reign over you will claim as his rights. He will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and still others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants. Your male and female servants and the best of your cattle and donkeys he will take for his own use. He will take 1/10 of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his slaves. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day."
main conclusion that we can draw is that God has remained faithful as we trace the story from Joshua through to Solomon. And God has remained faithful to his promises to bless all the families of the world through Abraham's descendants. And now this has become more specific, and we discover that it will come through the reign of a king who is a descendant of David, although it won't be Solomon. And of course, both the promises made to Abraham and the promise made to David, we see them as having their fulfillment in Jesus. And as the story moves forward, we see the two great temptations that Israel has faced and will continue to face right from the encounter between Joshua and the captain of God's army. We have mentioned quite a few times the temptation that the people of Israel have of taking God for granted. And as we've gone through the story, we've seen again and again the temptation to become like the other nations, and becoming like the other nations often is something that will lead Israel into following their gods, and how this is also a serious, and it will become an even more serious temptation as the story moves forward.